Hey everyone, this is Riddle Hugger Age Raven. I'm here with my recap and review of The Gilded Age Season number 1, Episode number 3, which is titled Face to Music. Now, this episode was basically about telling viewers that, you know what, you do not mess with the Russells, especially George Russell. Yeah, in the previous episode, he ended up helping Mr. Morris to tell his group of aldermen about the stocks and how they can buy the stocks and then they can make a lot of money when the railway station is constructed and all of that stuff. But in this episode, yeah, Mr. Morris and the rest of the aldermen decided to one up George Russell, and he did not take kindly to it. We'll get to it. We'll get to it. Yeah, it was another fun episode, in my opinion. So, episode number 3 actually opens up with basically Aunt Agnes being like, "Oh, okay, so Mrs. Fane is trying to hold another charity event. Wasn't the previous charity event enough for her? She was quite embarrassed, I would believe." And yeah, Marian is like, "Well, the bazaar ended up making like $2,000, which is unheard of. So of course they're going to continue with charity. People will always need charity." And as she sits down, this is where Moiraine from the Wheel of Time, Moiraine. But yeah, Miriam is like, "Do you know this person? This Clara Gladys person. Mrs. Fane is hosting her because she is going to talk about the Red Cross, the American branch of Red Cross, and I'm actually interested in going." And Ada is like, "Can I come with?" And they're like, Agnes is like, "Yeah, sure, sure, you both can go." Yeah, this was the scene where she's like, Clara Gladys, if I remember correctly. No, 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 my bad. Clara Burton. Yeah, Clarissa Burton, an actual person who ended up founding the American Red Cross. Yeah, Burton. So yeah, Agnes is going to, Aunt Ada is going to accompany Miriam to the charity event. And this is also where they end up talking about why Mrs. Russell hasn't introduced Gladys properly. And Aunt Agnes is like, "Well, it's actually because Mrs. Russell is actually doubts that she can fill up a ballroom, and that's why she doesn't want her daughter to be embarrassed and all of that stuff." And she's like, "You know what? I know about this stuff too, even if you guys think that I don't know." So we cut to Gladys, and Gladys is basically with her, I guess, her babysitter, who has been stealing brandy or whiskey from the dining area or something. But yeah, Gladys is actually interested in meeting this guy called Archibald, and she wants her babysitter to not say anything to her mom, or she'll tell her mom about her babysitter stealing. So we cut to downstairs, the kitchen, and this is where Bridget is helping the head cook with preparing food. And this guy walks in, this young guy. And again, the fact that I haven't memorized all of the names of the characters, that's not a good sign. Like the show should help me remember their names, but I don't necessarily care, which is concerning. But yeah, apparently there's this guy who has a lantern show and he wants to take Bridget with him, and he's like, "We'll take our day off, let's go Friday." And he ends up asking Mr. Barrister about taking a day off with Bridget, and Bridget is basically not very interested in going with him. So I guess there's something up with Bridget, which I guess we'll find out later on in the season. So Mrs. Russell walks in and she's like, "Oh, George, you're still in the office. I thought that you had gone." And he's like, "No, I just had some paperwork to sign, some letters to send." And she's like, "Okay, so how's the railway construction going? Is everything going well? Are the stocks up?" And George is like, "Yeah, it's all good." And she's like, "Okay, so what the heck is this?" And she ends up showing him the newspaper that actually talks about the law being not necessarily being passed and taken away and all of that stuff, which would stop George Russell from making the railway station that he wants. And of course, George is very, very mad about it. He's like, "You know what? I'll handle this. I handle this." And I'm like, "George, considering the type of person that you are, shouldn't you be reading the newspaper the first thing when you're up?" But you know what? It is what it is. So as Bertha is walking out of the office, this is where George is like, "Bertha, I need to ask you something. Why are you babying Gladys? She's a grown woman, and some women this age end up getting married." And Bertha is like, "Yeah, and they end up regretting it. So you know what, George? I know what I'm doing with my children. So let me do that." George ends up talking to Mr. Morris, and he's like, "Okay, Mr. Morris, you know what? I thought that you guys were greedy, like to make a quick buck, but I wasn't expecting you all to be greedy criminals because, yeah, George is not happy about how the rest of the aldermen ended up buying stocks, and now they took away the law, it won't be passed, and that would mean that George's company would be, yeah, it would go bankrupt, it would be destroyed, and George doesn't like that, and George is like, you know what, Mr. Morris, you have made your decision, now I'm going to retaliate. Then we cut to Clarissa Burton, and she's basically talking about how it's very important to give rise to the American Red Cross. Mrs. Astor is there, and they talk about the president who would be willing to go ahead with Miss Barton's plan and all of that stuff. So while everyone is talking and basically, I think they support her. I guess that's what I was getting, but I'm not really sure. So anyway, after she has given the speech, we are introduced to this new character. His name is Eckhart, and he apparently knows Aunt Agnes and Aunt Ada, and I think he has a thing for Aunt Ada. But we end up learning about what that's actually about later on in the episode. And yeah, Miriam is enjoying herself. She's actually interested in seeing her aunt basically flirting with this guy who ends up being Mrs. Morrison's uncle. I think that she's his niece. So yeah, Miriam is like, you know what, Aunt Agnes would be excited to meet you, so why don't you come over to our house? And Ada is kind of flustered because I guess Ada still has feelings for him. Basically, they knew each other when they were children. So Mr. Eckert walks away, and this is where Mrs. Fain comes in. And again, Miriam is like, if you guys want money from charity, why don't we ask Mrs. Russell? And Mrs. Fain is like, well, we don't necessarily have to do anything with the Russells anymore because Mr. Russell was very rude to Mr. Morris, and we are going to step away from them. And Miriam is like, well, there has to be more to the story, right? And Mrs. Fain is like, well, Miriam, you are way too reasonable to live. So we cut to the Russells, and yeah, Mr. Russell is trying to think of how to get back at Mr. Morris and the rest of the aldermen, and he's like, you know what, our company will be destroyed if I don't do anything because the stocks will plummet. And Bertha is like, well, if the stocks plummet, won't Mr. Morris and the rest of the aldermen face a loss? And Mr. Russell and George is like, no. This is basically a game. And trust me when I say that they will make their money back. And Bertha's like, well, isn't there anything that you can do? And George is like, well, I can do something, but I'll have to use my own finances. We might end up losing all of this. And Bertha is like, go for it, George. You already made it once. We can make it again. Do it. And I was like, oh, so she is a very, very supportive wife, a very ride or die kind of wife, which George appreciates. And I'm like, you know what? There's this maid in your house that's been flirting with George, and yeah, Bertha is not going to take kindly to it. So as George is walking away, Gladys meets him, and Gladys is like, Dad, I want to ask you something. I want to ask you a favor. And George is like, okay, but and yeah, George is basically like, okay, so you are basically afraid to ask your mom, and that's why you're asking me, right? And Gladys is like, that's exactly it. So this is where Miriam talks to Aunt Agnes about having met Eckhart and all of that stuff. And Agnes is like, yeah, I remember Eckhart, and he didn't necessarily have a lot of prospects, and that's why my father wasn't a fan of him and all of that stuff. And Miriam is like, well, he's back in New York and he wants to reconnect with old friends, so let him meet Aunt Agnes. And Aunt Agnes, yeah, she has her. She's not necessarily a fan of Mr. Eckhart, which again makes sense when we get to when we near the end of the episode. So Oscar comes in, and Agnes is like, "Where the heck are you going?" And he's like, "Well, I have lunch over at the Russells." And of course, Agnes doesn't like that, and she's like, "You know what? You saying that is as if I've been pierced, as if my side has been pierced by a knife." And Oscar is like, "Well, it's a good thing that you have a skin of a rhinoceros." So this is where George ends up meeting the maid, and again, the maid is flirting with him, and I'm like, don't do this, this isn't going to end well for you. So we cut to lunchtime, or maybe it's dinner, I'm not really sure. And yeah, I guess Mrs. Russell actually appreciates Oscar's presence, and they are all talking about Oscar's profession. He's a banker. His entire family is of bankers, and that's why he's a banker too. And Larry is like, well, it must be nice having everything planned out for you. And Oscar is like, yeah, it kind of is. And then Gladys is like, can we talk about Archibald? Because yeah, she has a thing for Archibald, but Oscar wants to marry Gladys, and Oscar is like, well, isn't Archibald a bit too young for you? So they keep on talking. And this is where Oscar asks George about the railway, and yeah, George is like, "Well, these things take time, Oscar. They do." And then they talk about the museum, and Oscar is like, "Well, I'm not a fan of the Romanesque style. What about you, Gladys?" And basically, Oscar is flirting with Gladys, and Bertha notices it. Bertha notices it, and I think that Bertha would be okay with Oscar marrying Gladys, but let's see what happens. So Mr. Reichs ended up writing to Miriam, and yeah, Agnes isn't a fan. Agnes is like, okay, so what does this letter mean to you, Miriam? And Miriam's like, well, it means nothing. He's just a friend, and he ended up supporting me when no one else would. After my dad died, I should be grateful for being in his company of such a friend. And Agnes is like, you know what, Miriam, I'm warning you right now. Mr. Reichs is an adventurer. And basically, I think that during that time, an adventurer would be like a flirt who just wants to hook up with women and break their hearts and all of that stuff. Basically, excited about the chase. And yeah, Miriam doesn't appreciate Agnes's tone, and she walks away. Then we cut to Bertha and Russell, and this is where Russell is, not Russell, George. Yeah, Bertha and George is like, am I wrong, or do you think that Oscar is interested in Gladys? And Bertha is like, yeah, you could. I think you're right that he could be interested in Gladys. And George is like, well, Gladys is going to be a very, very rich young lady, and I don't want a man trying to marry her just for the money. And I think that Oscar is in it for the money. But yeah, I think that as far as Bertha is concerned, she's okay with it. She's okay with it because even though Oscar wants to marry Gladys, as far as Bertha is concerned, that marriage would allow her to have an entry into the upper class of the society that they're trying to get into. Then we cut to Oscar with his boyfriend, John Adams. And yeah, this is where Oscar ends up telling John that, you know what, both of us knew that we were going to marry one day. And yeah, Oscar is being very, very realistic about it, especially considering that he's a queer person back in that era. And yeah, again, it made sense that he's being realistic. He wants the money. He wants to marry Gladys, someone young, who is very innocent, who is very kind, and who wouldn't suspect a thing. And John Adams is like, well, what about us? What about us? The Pink song. Yeah, and Oscar is like, well, it doesn't have to change anything, but then again, it could be that I might end up actually enjoying hooking up with Gladys. I might go straight. Or bisexual, but I don't think that Oscar is bisexual, but you know what? Who knows? And yeah, he's like, I'm just teasing you. So we cut to George Russell, and George Russell is like, you know what? I have a plan. I know what we can do to get back at the aldermans. And he's like, you know what? I want you. He tells his, I think that this is his second in command or something. And he's like, you know what? Go and buy up all of the stocks that come to the market from the company. And I want it to be anonymous. I don't want all of that to be tracked down to me, at least not yet. And we're going to buy it with our own money so that the stocks don't plummet for the company. And yeah, the eldermen end up sweating. So we cut to Miriam, and Peggy is there as well. So Peggy is here to meet Mr. Reichs, and but Miriam wants to talk to Mr. Reichs as well. So they go in first. And this is where Mr. Reichs is like, well, I'm in New York and I would like to do some sightseeing. Would you mind accompanying me to a hotel for some food or drink or stuff? And Miriam is like, well, we can't meet in a hotel, right? And Mr. Reichs is like, when were you the one to follow rules? And she's like, well, it's not like that I'm following rules. It's just that I have to fit in the society that I find myself in. And this is where Mr. Reichs is like, you know what? Let's go to the park. The hand of the Statue of Liberty is there, so we can go and see that. No one would mind that, right? Just two friends walking in the park. And Miriam is like, yeah, we can do that. So after Miriam leaves, this is where Mr. Reichs ends up inviting Peggy into the office, and they are talking about something that Peggy is involved in, some sort of mystery, I guess, which I'm interested in seeing where that leads. So Mr. Morris ends up talking to Mr. Fane, and he's like, you know what, Mr. Fane, George Russell's company stocks aren't falling. We are in trouble. And Mr. Fane is like, well, he's basically buying the stocks with his own money. Don't worry, he'll run out soon enough. And I'm like, he won't run out. So Mr. Morris is very, very concerned about what might happen to him because he ended up investing a lot in the stocks. And if they fall, then yeah, he'll lose everything. So as he's walking down the stairs, he ends up meeting Oscar. And this is where he tells Oscar that, you know what, word on the street is that the Russell is going going to that the Russells are going to lose all of their money, and Oscar doesn't like that because again he is basically wanting to marry Gladys. For just the money, and he's like, oh, okay, I never thought that Mr. Russell would run out of money. So Peggy ends up getting an letter from a news publication company, and they want to talk to her to hopefully publish some of her short stories. And everyone excited about it except this woman, which I'm like, oh, come on, stop being so sour. So Peggy is way too excited to eat lunch, so she walks away, and this is where Mr. Barrister tells the young help that, you know what, even though you guys will be going out this Friday, I want you back at curfew by 10. And yeah, Bridget is very excited to say that yes, we'll be back. And I'm like, Bridget, what's up, what's happening here? So we cut to dinner at Mrs. Fane, and Mrs. Astor is there as well, and they're talking about how politics are involved in the Red Cross thing, and then they end up talking about this new opera house being made or whatnot. I didn't necessarily understand the conversation, but yeah, it was kind of boring. It was kind of boring because Miriam is like, you know what? Why don't we let rich people make better things? And yeah, the rest of the people on the table don't appreciate her tone. And Ada is like, let other people speak, Miriam. So Peggy's dad ends up coming to meet her, and they're walking outside the house, and this is where Peggy's father is like, Peggy, I want you to come back home for your mom's birthday. You will be here, right? And I forgive you and all of that stuff. And Peggy is like, wait, you forgive me? Because as far as I understand, I'm not really sure what actually happened between these two, but I guess it's her father's fault. But his father doesn't realize that, or at least he doesn't want to accept it. But Peggy is stuck. And Peggy is like, yeah, tell mom that I'll be back. And he's like, why don't you come back with me? I've heard that you're working as a secretary for the Van Rahens. And she's like, yep, I am. And I also have a call from a publisher who is interested in publishing my short stories. And yeah, his dad is like, okay, Peggy, but considering that the type of person you are, I don't think that it's going to work out well for you. And if it doesn't, you can always come back and have a job and come back and work for me. And Peggy is like, yeah, we'll see about that. So we cut to Mr. Watson, and Mr. Watson is ready to go out, and this woman ends up asking Mr. Watson about where he's going and why he always goes out in the afternoon for an hour or two. And he's like, well, I don't necessarily go anywhere specific. I just like to walk. And I'm like, don't say that Mr. Watson is some sort of a serial killer. So Miss Turner, I think her name is Miss Turner, right? And this is where the other woman is like, Miss Turner, I think that Mr. Watson might have a thing for you. And Miss Turner is like, well, I'm not going to waste any time on him. I've got bigger fish to try. So Miriam and Aunt Ada are walking back home, and this is where Miriam is like, well, if the charity wants money, why don't we get the money from the Russells or even from the Chamberlains? And Ada is like, you know what, the Russells, okay, you have a point. We could ask money from the Russells, but you know what, never the Chamberlains. And this is where we find out that the reason that the rest of women aren't very interested in associating with Mrs. Chamberlain is because Mrs. Chamberlain, I guess, ended up hooking up with her husband before their marriage, and they had a child before wedlock, which, yeah, that's very scandalous considering the time that they're in. So Mrs. Fane is talking to her husband, and she's like, okay, so I guess you guys will be losing money, huh? Why don't you go and ask for forgiveness and all of that stuff? And why is George Russell doing all of this? And yeah, Mr. Fane is like, well, we thought that we could handle the situation, but I guess George Russell has more money than God. So yeah, they are in a pickle. So Bridget and the young man are watching the lantern show, and one of the scenes has this train coming towards the viewers, and that scares Bridget. And the guy is like, hey, I'll take care of you, and she's like, not like that, not like that. So I guess something happened in Bridget's past, and that's why she's acting like this when it comes to being flirty or being friendly with this young man, or maybe she's married and she hasn't told anyone. Who knows? So Mr. Morris, because he wants to save all of the money, he ends up basically scolding his wife, and he's like, you know what, I need you to go, and I need you to talk to Mrs. Russell, and I need you to beg for her forgiveness, because it was because of you that George is doing all of this. And she's like, don't make me do this, Mr. Morris, don't make me do this. And he's like, no, you have to do this because we will lose everything, the house, the money, the status, everything. You have to do this. So Bridget and the young man are walking out of the theater, and and she's like, you know what, we have to go back because the curfew is at 10, and we told Mr. Bannister that. And he's like, well, they don't own us, Bridget. We can go back late. And she's like, no, 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 let's go. And yeah, again, he's like, can I at least hold your hand? And she's like, no. So we cut to Oscar and his boyfriend, and yeah, he's very unhappy about the fact that he actually was willing, he was actually looking forward to marrying Gladys, and he's like, you know what? But the fact that they might end up losing money, I guess I'll have to find someone else. And John Adams is like, well, you will. I guess you will. And Oscar is like, well, that's not the point. She was perfect. She was perfect. And I'm like, wait, 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 wait. Is Oscar really falling for Gladys? Is he going to be revealed to be bisexual? My bad. And I'm like, you know what? I'm okay with a show like this having bisexual representation, but then again, when it comes to bisexual representation in media, there's a trope that bisexuals can't necessarily keep it in their pants and they would like to hook up with everyone, even though they're already in a committed relationship. And I'm like, don't go down this route. Don't go down this route. I don't want bisexual representation in the Gilded Age to be messy, but let's see what happens. So Peggy goes to meet Mr. Carlton, who basically runs the publication, and she's waiting. And this guy comes in, and he's like, Miss Peggy Scott. And she stands up, and of course, he's very taken aback because he didn't realize that Miss Peggy Scott was a black woman. And yeah, that surprises him. And that's like, you know what, Mr. Carlton is very busy. He won't be able to see you today. And Peggy is like, you know what, I'm actually willing to wait for him. And he's like, okay, suit yourself. So we got yeah, and talking about this particular scene again, when I reviewed the premiere of the Gilded Age, I mentioned that I wasn't really sure how Julian Fellows would handle the racial tones of this show because Downton Abbey didn't have a lot of it. But considering that we are in episode number 3, I think that he's doing a good job. I think that he's doing a good job of handling the racial issues during that era. So Mrs. Morris decides to basically ask Bertha to do her a favor, and she's like, you know what? I want you to ask Mr. Russell to be kind to the other aldermen. And Bertha's like, wait. You want me to interfere with my husband's business? And Mrs. Morris like, well, it's not basically interference. It sounds bad. Sounds bad when you put it like that. I just want you to tell your husband to show us mercy. And Bertha's like, but why would I do that? What is all of this in payment for? And Mrs. Morris like, excuse me, I don't understand you. And this is where I really enjoyed this conversation because Bertha was like, well, basically relationships are like banks. You have to make a deposit before you can withdraw anything. And you know what, Mrs. Morris, considering how you have treated me, I don't think that I would be showing such gratitude to you. And he basically asks Mrs. Morris to walk away. And I'm like, wow. You know what? I understand where Bertha is coming from, but if I was in Mrs. Morris's place, I would have begged Bertha, and I would be like, you know what, Bertha, I want you to do this with me, do this favor for me as a debt, and I'll be indebted to you, and I'll end up doing a favor for you down the line. How about that? I think that Mrs. Morris could have said that. But then again, I think that even though Mrs. Morris was sent by her husband to basically ask Bertha for forgiveness, I still think that she basically was looking down on Bertha, and that's why she didn't want to be indebted to Bertha. Or else, I think that she should have said that, you know what, Bertha, if you do this favor for me, I'll owe you. So how about that? But yeah, she doesn't say that because again, I still think that she still looked down on Bertha. So this was a very very interesting scene. Again, considering the racial issues of that time. So basically, Mr. Carlton is very impressed by Peggy's stories, and he wants to publish them in the newspaper. However, he has certain conditions. Now, the first condition is that one of her stories actually stars a little black girl, and he wants Peggy to change that into a poor white girl so that his readership could relate to the character. And Peggy is like, what about the other conditions? And he's like, well, the other condition is that, you know what, we are going to own your stories. You can still use your name. However, you will be forbidden to publicly share that you are the author behind these stories, because if we do that, then our readership in the South, we will lose them. And Peggy is like, wow, wow. And even I was like, wow. Like back then, the how people of color, especially the black community, was treated, it was just wow. Wow. But yeah, Peggy, because she is a very strong woman. She's like, you know what, Mr. Carlton, I appreciate your offer, I guess, but I won't accept your conditions because yeah, she wants to be an author, and one of the things that's very important to authors that they want to publicly stand by their work, they want to publicly share their work, and the fact that Mr. Carlton wasn't going to allow that, I actually like the fact that Peggy didn't agree to his terms and conditions, and Mr. Carlton is like, you know what, I want to publish you, but it's just that the system is built that way. And I'm like, Carlton, you can kind of fight the system if you really want to. So Peggy and Miriam are walking on the street, and this is where Peggy tells Miriam about what happened at the publishers, and Miriam is like, you know what, it's okay. If one door closes for you, you'll more doors will open for you, and all of that stuff. And Peggy is like, yeah, but again, it's just that I don't like the fact that that all of this made my father what my father said be true, and yeah, I don't like that because she doesn't want her father to be right when it comes to her wanting to pursue a career in publishing. So they're at the park. Mr. Rikes is here, and then we get a little scene talking about the Statue of Liberty's hand with the torch, and this is where these two end up walking, and Peggy is close by to keep an eye on them, and this is where Mr. Rikes basically ends up proposing to Miriam, and I'm like, wow, 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 he is actually proposing in the third episode, and Miriam doesn't say anything. She doesn't say no. She's quite. She doesn't necessarily know what to do in such a situation. And Mr. Rikes is like, you know what? I'm going to keep asking you until you say no, Miriam, because I have loved you ever since I met you and all of that stuff. And I'm like, you know what? Mr. Rikes was being quite respectable with how he handled the situation, because yeah, he is kind of after her, but he is being respectful in a way, because again, he's like, you know what, if you say no, then I'll stop. And Miriam doesn't say no. And you know what, if if a person that you like ends up saying no and you still go after them, that's problematic. That's problematic. So he's like, I'll await your answer, and he walks away, and Miriam ends up telling Peggy about what just happened. Peggy is like, okay, so what did you say? What did you say? You said no, right? And Miriam was like, no, I didn't say anything. So it's time for Ecker to come over to the aunt's house for tea. And yeah, Agnes is like, Ada, can you go downstairs and tell the cook that we will be free for tea? And she's like, well, she already knows. And Agnes is like, just go, Ada. I want to talk. I want to gossip with Mr. Eckert. And yeah, this is where Agnes ends up reading Mr. Eckert. And he's like, you know what? I can see what you're trying to do. Yeah, Agnes is like, you know what? I can see what you're trying to do, Mr. Eckert. But I have to warn you, Ada has no money to her name, and if she ends up marrying you, she will have to leave this house. She has no properties to her name, none of the money, and I don't think that you will be interested in Ada after I've told you all of this, right? And Eckert is like, no, 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 no. I think that you have got me all wrong. And Agnes is like, really, really? Because I remember that you were at the bar yesterday and you were talking about how you were going to marry a meal ticket. So, Mr. Eckert, I know what your intentions are with my sister, and I won't allow you to continue with them. And I'm like, yeah, okay, Agnes, come true, looking out for her sister. So Ada walks in, and Eckert is like, I have to go. And Ada is like, what the heck was that about? And Agnes is like, well, he's a very busy man, Ada. And yeah, she feels sorry for her sister too, and she's like, let me spoil you, Ada. Let me know what you want to eat. Let's set the menu. And Ada is like, why? Why? What's the occasion? And Agnes is like, no occasion. I just want to spoil you. She's trying to make it up to her sister. And considering the Eckert situation, I really hope that Ada actually meets a person who likes her for herself and not because he thinks that she'll get a lot of money down the line. So this was another powerful scene where all of the aldermen end up coming to George Russell's office, and yeah, Mr. Morris is like, I'm going to lose everything. I beg of you, if you want me to kneel, I'll beg. And he's sobbing, and he just wants George Russell to have mercy on the aldermen. He doesn't want to lose money to George Russell. And Russell is like, it's not that I don't pity you, it's just that you and your wife ended up belittling and snubbing my own wife. So How can I let that go unpunished? And yeah, George Russell, you do not mess with George Russell. So Mr. Morris comes back home and he ends up telling his wife that he's very proud of her and all of that stuff. And his wife is like, Morris, what's wrong? And he's like, oh, nothing wrong. I'll come down and sit with you, but just give me a second. And he goes up to his office, and you could just tell that he's going to take his own life. And yeah, the episode actually ends with Berta and Russell talking about what just happened. And Berta's like, okay, so all of the situation is handled. And George is like, yep, the aldermen won't be messing with me any longer. And you know what? I think that I've punished them enough. And I think I'll forgive them now. But yeah, I think it's a bit too late for Mr. Morris, because Mr. Morris ended up killing himself. So even if George ends up being forgiving to the rest of the aldermen, Mr. Morris is no more, and I think with Mr. Morris gone, I guess Mrs. Morris will lose her money or something. I'm not really sure. Or maybe George will help her out somehow. I'm looking forward to seeing how that pans out. But yeah, this is where the episode ends, which was again basically about the Russell family and George and Bertha Russell basically being personifications of the statement that fuck around and find out. But yeah, let me know what you thought of the episode down in the comment section below. And until next time, stay happy, stay safe, stay blessed. See you guys later.